The Allegory of the Online Business Model, a dialogue between Preston and Brody. At this point, I want to show you something about the nature of real business and delusion. Picture the following inside of your mind. Imagine a generation of young men living in a vast underground feed, a digital cave, if you will. Its entrance opens up to the real world and stretches endlessly in every direction, but none of them have ever looked towards it. They have been there since they were 15 or 16 years old, their attention chained, their thumbs locked to a glass screen, unable to look away or think for themselves, forced to scroll forward. The glow from a great algorithm blazing behind them, the combined light of TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter casts its light from above and behind them. Between the algorithm and these young men, there is a raised platform. Now imagine a low wall built along this platform, similar to the screen that divides a magician from his audience and allows him to perform his tricks above it. Brody says, I can picture the scene. Now Preston says, imagine that behind this wall walks the influencers. They carry various objects held high above the wall so that the light of the algorithm casts enormous shadows onto the cave wall in front of the chained young men. The objects they carry include Lamborghinis, Rolexes, rented Airbnbs, private jets, stacks of cash still in their bank-issued bands, screenshots of striped dashboards showing 6 figures in a single month. Some of these influencers narrate loudly as they pass. I made $10,000 before breakfast, while others simply hold the objects in silence and just let the algorithm do the talking. Now Brody says, you paint a strange picture and describe strange prisoners. Preston says, well, they're exactly like us. Now, do you think these chained young men see anything real? Or do they see only the shadows of those objects, the idea of the Lamborghini, the idea of the Rolex, the promise of the income, which the light of the algorithm projects onto the wall before them? Brody says, how could they see the real objects if they have never once turned around? They have been scrolling since middle school. Preston says, exactly. And what do you see of the objects being carried? They see only the shadows, the 2-minute clips, the thumbnails, the captions that read, here's the exact blueprint. They never see the influencer behind the wall, only the performance of success projected forward. Brody says, what else could they possibly see? Preston says, and if these young men could talk to one another, which they do constantly in group chats, Discord servers, and TikTok reply threads, would they not believe that the shadows themselves are real things? Would they not call these shadows by name and debate them endlessly? One calls a shadow SMMA, another calls the shadow e-commerce, another says TikTok shop, another whispers high-ticket sales, yet another has discovered something called vibe coding. They give names to the shadows as if naming them grants ownership of the thing itself. Brody says, absolutely. That is exactly what they would do. Preston says, and what if the algorithm produces a sound, a notification ping, a viral audio clip, a voiceover saying that this changed my life, and it echoes off the cave wall? Would these young men not believe the voice belongs to the shadows itself? Would they not think the business model is speaking to them personally? Brody says, without a question. Preston says, then these prisoners would believe that the truth is nothing more than the shadows of Lamborghinis and income screenshots projected by an algorithm that they have never turned around to examine. They would call this truth the game, and they would say they are in the game, and they would build their entire identity around which shadow they have chosen to chase. Brody says, that is certain. Preston says, now imagine what would happen if one of these young men were released from his chains and forced to confront what was actually behind him. Let's say one day his phone dies and he does not charge it immediately. Or someone installs a screen time blocker on his device, something like Opal, and suddenly, for the first time in years, his feed goes dark. He is forced to stand up, turn his neck, and turn toward the algorithm's light. These actions will cause him genuine pain. The brightness of unfiltered reality will sting his eyes because he has only ever seen these shadows, and now he must look at the fire itself and the objects that cast the shadows. Now, what do you think he would say if someone told him that what he was watching before was an illusion, that the SMMA blueprint was a shadow of a rented Lamborghini held up by a 23-year-old who makes his real money selling courses about the shadow? What if this person pointed to the actual objects and said, that is not a business, that is a prop, and that's not an entrepreneur, that's a puppeteer? Do you not think that the young man would be confused and would believe the shadows he formerly watched were more real than what is now being shown to him? Brody says, far more real. He would want to go back to the feed immediately. Preston says, and if he were forced to look directly at the algorithm, to study how TikTok's recommendation engine actually works, to understand that the content he was shown was not chosen for its truth, but for its ability to keep him chained, would that not make his head hurt? Would he not flinch and try to return to the shadows, which are comfortable and familiar? Would he not say, I would rather watch another day in my life as a 21-year-old CEO than think about this? Brody says he absolutely would. Preston says, but what if someone dragged him against his will up a steep and difficult path away from the cave entirely? What if someone forced him to delete the apps, to sit in the silence, to read an actual book, to study an actual skill, to look at an actual market with actual demand? Would you not feel pain and resistance the entire way up? And when he finally emerged into the sunlight of how business actually works, real revenue, real customers, real margins, would he be able to see any of it clearly at first? Brody says, no. Not right away. His eyes would need time. Preston says, I think that if he wanted to understand the upper world, the world of real business, he would need to adjust gradually. First, he would see the shadows of real things. Perhaps he noticed that every piece of software that he already uses on the daily basis was built by someone, and someone is getting paid every time he opens it. He would see that reflection first, the vague outline of the model. After that, he would see the reflections of real businesses in the water. He might read about how white labeling software works, how ordinary people license existing software platforms under their own name and brand and then sell them to local businesses who desperately need them. He would see the reflection before he saw the thing itself. Only after that would he look at the business directly, the actual mechanics of reoccurring revenue, the actual process of offering a product that people need and will pay for monthly, the actual math of building something that compounds. And he would look at these things first in small, dim light, a single client, a single win, before he could stare at the full sun. Brody says, how could it be otherwise? And Preston says, and last of all, he would see the sun itself. He would understand that the sun, the fundamental principle that illuminates everything, is simply this: find a real problem, solve it with existing technology, and charge for the ongoing solution. He would see that this principle is responsible for every legitimate business that has ever endured, and it governs all the commerce in the visible world, and that in some ways, this principle was even the cause of shadows back in the cave. Because the influencers were, in their distorted way, trying to gesture at it, even as they obscured it. Brody says clearly he would come to that conclusion after having seen how things truly work. Preston says, now tell me, when he remembers where he used to spend his time and the so-called wisdom of the group chats and the other young men still chained beside him, all arguing about whether SMMA or ecom was the better shadow, would he not feel a profound change in himself? Would he not pity those who stayed behind? Brody says, without question. And Preston says, and what about the honors and status that were given out inside the cave? Remember, there were young men who were praised by others for their ability to identify which shadow was trending, to predict which business model would go viral next, to remember which influencer said what and in what sequence. These men were considered powerful and wise among the cave dwellers. They had the most followers on Discord. They were moderators. They were tagged in every thread of the posts. Do you think our freed man would envy those honors? Or would he prefer, as Homer once said, to work as an unknown laborer in the real world, rather than go back to be a king of the shadows. And Brody says, I think he would rather do anything than live that way again. And Preston says, now imagine this. Suppose this person goes back down into the cave. Suppose he returns to the same group chat, the same Discord server, the same feeds. His eyes accustomed to how now sunlight would suddenly be filled with darkness. He would stumble. The shadows would look blurry and meaningless now to him. Brody says, that is certain. And Preston says, and what would happen if he tried to compete again with the permanent cave dwellers in identifying and naming the shadows? Remember that his eyes not yet readjusted to the darkness, and this readjustment might take considerable time. Would he not seem foolish to them? Would they not laugh at him and say, he went up and came back down, and now he cannot even name basic business models? Would they not say, he's cooked, he fumbled the bag, he's washed? Brody said they absolutely would. And Preston says, and suppose he then tried to describe what he saw above. Suppose he said, listen, these shadows are not real businesses. The influencer's holding up rented props. The algorithm is a fire designed to keep you seated. There's a real world up there where people build actual companies with actual reoccurring revenue, and the model that works is not glamorous at all. It is white labeling software. It is serving small businesses. It is showing up every day, solving boring problems for people who will pay you monthly. What do you think they would say? And he says, I can tell you exactly what they would say. Preston says, they would say that it is a pyramid scheme. Brody says, without a doubt. And Preston said, they would say, that's just an MLM with extra steps. They would say, you sound like every other guru. They would say, if it actually worked, everyone would be doing it. And if he persisted, if he tried to unchain even one of them and lead them towards the entrance, would they not turn on him? Would they not report his posts, mock him in the group chat, try to destroy his credibility? If they could lay their hands on his reputation, would they not kill it? Brody says, no doubt about it. Preston says, now Brody, apply this entire picture to our previous discussion. The cave is the feed, the endless scroll of TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. The fire is the algorithm that decides what shadows are projected. The chains are dopamine loops that keep young men seated and scrolling. The influencers are puppeteers walking behind the wall, carrying props they do not own and projecting shadows of success they have not achieved, or achieved only by selling the projection itself. The shadows are the business models named SMMA, dropshipping, e-commerce, TikTok shop, high ticket closer, vibe coding, names given to shadows as if naming them makes them real. And the sun, the thing that illuminates everything once you climb out, is the simple, unsexy, boring truth. Find a real need, use existing technology to fill it, charge reoccurring revenue, and compound it over time. In the world of real knowledge, this idea of genuine value exchange appears last of all, and we are barely capable of seeing it because it is not dramatic. It does not fit in a 2-minute clip. It cannot be projected as a shadow. However, when we do manage to see it, we understand it as the source of all real wealth. It is the principle behind every company that has lasted longer than a single product launch. And anyone who intends to build something real, whether for himself or for others, must keep his mind fixed on this principle. Brody says, I think I follow you as far as I can. And Preston says, then follow me one step further. You should not be surprised that those who escape the cave have no desire to go back and argue about the shadows. Their minds long to remain in the sunlight, to keep building, to keep serving real clients, to keep compounding. This is how they naturally behave. Can you blame them? Brody says, no, it makes perfect sense. Preston says, now consider this carefully. Suppose one of those people comes back down from the clarity of real business to participate in the daily debates of the cave dwellers. His eyes are still weak in the darkness. He cannot speak their language anymore. He has forgotten which shadow was trending and which influencer said what. And suppose he is dragged into an argument about which business model is the best, forced to debate shadows of SMMA versus ecom with people who have never seen the objects casting those shadows, let alone the sunlight beyond. Is it any wonder he makes a fool of himself? Is it surprising that they call him a scammer? Not for a moment, Brody says. And Preston says, but anyone else with sense would consider the situation before laughing. A person's vision can be confused for 2 reasons. The first is when someone comes from the light and then enters the dark, he cannot see the shadows because he has seen real things, and the shadows now seem absurd to him. The second is when someone comes from the dark and enters the light. He is blinded because he has never seen anything real at all. Now, a thoughtful person, upon meeting someone who seems confused, would first ask, is this person confused because he just left the sunlight of a real experience, or because he has never left the cave? And depending on the answer, he would consider the first person fortunate, and the second one deserving of compassion, not mockery. Brody says that is very reasonable. And Preston says, if this is correct, then our way of thinking about business education should be as follows. We must not believe it works the way these so-called gurus claim it works, for they say that knowledge is not present in the student and that they must put it in there, that the student is empty and the guru fills him, like pouring a course into a hollow skull. Brody says, that is exactly what they say. Buy my course and I will give you the blueprint. And Preston says, but our discussion here suggests something different. The capacity to see truth, as well as the instrument that allows a person to learn and build, already exists in everyone. It is not that you lack the ability. It is that your ability has been pointed in the wrong direction. Your entire attention, your entire soul, if you will, has been turned towards the wall of shadows since you were a teenager. The task is not to install new eyes. It is to turn these existing eyes around, away from the shadows, away from the algorithm, away from the feed until you are looking at what is actually real. Is this not true? And Brody says it is. Preston says, so there ought to be an art of turning around, not an art that gives you a vision. You already have that, but an art that helps you turn efficiently from darkness to light, from consumption to creation, from naming shadows to building substance. Should there not be such an art? Brody says there should. And Preston says, now the other so-called virtues of business, discipline, consistency, showing up, doing outreach, come closer to the habits of the body. Even when they are not initially present, they can be developed through repetition and practice. But the virtue of seeing clearly, of knowing what is actually worth building, that is something more fundamental. It never loses its power. The sharpness of the mind is always there. The only question is, which direction is it pointed? Have you ever noticed a clever young man? How sharp his instincts are, how quickly he identifies trends, how keenly his mind reads a market. His vision is excellent. But when that vision is pointed at these shadows, the sharper he sees, the faster he sprints in the wrong direction. He becomes the best in the cave at identifying the shadows, and he calls this intelligence. Brody says that is painfully true. And Preston says, but what if the same sharpness were turned around? What if from the beginning, or at least from the moment he first questions the cave, his instrument of sight were freed from the lead-in weights of dopamine and clout and viral validation? What if instead of seeing which shadow was trending, he saw which real problem was unsolved? Would that same mind not see reality as sharply as it currently sees the shadows? Brody says, most likely, perhaps even more sharply. Preston says, now consider the two categories of people. The first are the young men who have never questioned the cave at all. They have no single aim in life except to chase whatever shadow the algorithm projects next. They bounce from SMA to e-com to TikTok shop to AI automation every 90 days and wonder why nothing compounds. The second category are those who see the truth and then refuse to come back. They build in private, serve their clients, and never share what they have learned, thinking that they have already escaped and owe nothing to those still chained. Neither of these categories is fit to lead. The first because they have no direction, the second because they will not act. Brody says, very true. Preston says, then if we were building something worth building, our task would be to take the sharpest minds and show them the way out, compel them to make the climb, let them see how business actually works, real value, real clients, real revenue that recurs. But once they have seen the sunlight, we must not allow them to stay up there forever in comfortable isolation. We must ask them to go back down. Go back down into the cave, Brody says? But that is asking them to suffer. Would we not be making their lives worse when they simply could just remain in the light and build in peace? Preston says, you forget, Brody, that the point is not the comfort of any single person. The point is that people are still chained. People are still watching shadows and calling them careers. And the only ones who can show them the way out are the ones who have already made the climb. If the people who see clearly refuse to go back, then the cave will be governed forever by those who are best at naming shadows, by the influencers, the moderators, the replies, by those who have never once turned around. Brody said, I had not considered that. And Preston says, and we will not be doing wrong to those who have seen the truth by asking them to go back down. We will say to them, in other communities, people figure things out alone and owe nothing to anyone. But here we helped turn your eyes around. We showed you what was real, and you must take turns going back into the cave, getting accustomed again to the darkness and helping others see. Because once you do get used to the conditions down there again, you will see 1,000 times more clearly than those who never left. You will know that every shadow actually is and what object casts it, because you have seen now the real thing. You will know that SMA is a shadow of a legitimate service business, and that e-com is a shadow of a real product market fit, and high ticket sales is a shadow of genuine value exchange. And you will be able to explain the difference. And in this way, whatever we are building together will be guided by people who have actually seen reality, and not by those who fight each other about which shadows are the most profitable. Brody says that is fair. And Preston says, and the truth is this: whatever is built in the best and most enduring way will be built by those who are reluctant to perform, the ones who would rather build quietly than go viral, the ones who feel the weight of going back into the cave, but do it anyways because they know there are people that are still chained. And whatever is built by those most desperate to be seen, those who crave the followers, who need the clout, but cannot resist projecting their own shadow onto the wall, that will fare the worst. Brody says, I believe that completely. And Preston says, then what do you think? When the ones who have seen this light hear this, will they refuse? Will they stay up in the sunlight and never go back? Brody says, no, because we are asking something fair of people who understand fairness. Each of them will feel it is right to go back, which is the exact opposite of how things work inside the cave, where everyone fights to be the loudest shadow. Preston says, so this is how things stand, Brody. If you want to build something that actually lasts, you must design a life for the builders that is better than the life of mere influence. Only then the right people lead. People who are rich not in followers but in clarity, not in screenshots, but in the kind of understanding that a genuine free person should possess. But if those who are starving for attention and status take charge of the community, thinking that the clout is the ultimate good, then everything will collapse. The fight for visibility will destroy both themselves and everyone who follows them. Brody says that is exactly right. Preston says, then the only life that truly looks down upon the performance of success is the life that has actually built something real. The life that has seen the sun, the life that knows the difference between a shadow and the thing itself. Can you think of any other kind of life that earns that freedom? Brody says, by God, I cannot. Thank you.